They say the camera never lies, but they never told me what happens when the film starts predicting. My name is Elias, and I'm a ghost hunter, not the kind with flickering meters and plastic gadgets, but the kind who digs through 35mm archives of people who no longer exist. This basement, this development room, is my sanctuary. It smells of stale tobacco, cheap scotch, and the sharp, acidic sting of silver nitrate. I spend my nights watching the dead dance in grainy black and white, their smiles flickering at 24 frames per second. But tonight, the archive breathed back. I found the canister at the bottom of a crate marked "Confiscated, 1938." No label, no studio, just a rusted tin that felt colder than the rest, as if it had been stored in a freezer instead of a damp basement. I threaded the lead into the projector, the rhythmic click-clack of the sprocket sounding like a heartbeat in the silence of the room. The light hit the wall, cutting through the haze of my cigarette smoke, like a surgeon's scalpel. I froze. The image on the wall wasn't a dusty ballroom or a silent starlet. It was this room, my desk, my half-empty glass, my shaking hands. On the screen, a man sat in the same moth-eaten coat I'm wearing now. He was hunched over, staring at a projector. It was me, but the film me wasn't just a reflection. He was terrified. On the screen, I watched myself turn around and look directly into the lens. Eyes wide with a plea I couldn't yet understand, I pointed a trembling finger at the heavy oak door behind us. In the movie, the door was slowly, silently creaking open. In my reality, the door was shut tight, bolted from the inside. I checked my watch. The film me checked his. We were sent, but the celluloid was running fast. Exactly 120 seconds fast. It wasn't a recording of the past. It was a broadcast of the next 2 minutes of my life. A countdown. I watched the screen me reach for the glass of scotch. 2 minutes later, my own hand moved of its own accord. My fingers trembled. The glass slipped, shattering against the floor. I wasn't living my life anymore. I was rehearsing it. Then, the ink appeared. On the grainy wall, a silhouette began to bleed into the frame. A tall, distorted figure made of thick, wet charcoal and jagged ink splashes. It didn't walk. It manifested, rising from the shadows in the corner of the room that stood right behind the film version of me, a nightmare carved out of graphite. I spun around. My corner was empty. Only the smell of damp earth and old paper filled the air. I turned back to the screen, desperate. The film me was screaming now, but the movie was silent. The ink man reached out a hand that looked like a cluster of jagged knives. On the screen, I felt the phantom touch on my neck. I looked at the timer on the projector. 30 seconds left. The film me vanished. The screen went white, flickering with the frantic end of reel dance of dust and scratches. The room on the wall was empty now. Just the chair, the broken glass, and the ink man standing exactly where I was sitting. The real door behind me groaned. The bolt, which I had slid into place an hour ago, began to move, slowly, silently. I looked at the wall one last time. The scratches on the film weren't just damage anymore. They were words, scrawled in the frantic, messy style of a man losing his mind. Don't look back. The film hissed in a language of light and shadow. The ink never dries. But the death I expected didn't come. Instead, the light of the projector intensified. It grew so bright that the shadows in the room began to stretch and warp, becoming physical objects. The walls of my basement began to ripple like paper in a heavy wind. I realized I wasn't in my basement anymore. I was falling into the frame. The world around me lost its color, its depth, its reality. Every object became a sketch. The air was thick with the smell of wet lead and burning celluloid. I reached out to touch my desk, but my hand passed through it as if it were nothing but a collection of charcoal lines. I stood up, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were being drawn by an exhausted artist who was running out of graphite. I looked down. My shoes were leaving permanent ink stains on the floor. Every step I took was a mark on the world that could never be erased. In the distance, I heard the sound of a city, but it wasn't the sound of cars or people. It was the sound of 1,000 pens scratching frantically against paper, a rhythmic, abrasive noise that made my teeth ache. I walked toward the door, which was now just a jagged hole in the reality of the room. Outside, the city of shadows awaited. It was a metropolis built of mistakes and discarded ideas. Skyscrapers leaned at impossible angles, held up by nothing but thick, black cross-hatching. The sky was a pale, sickly gray filled with the horizontal lines of a stormy sky that never moved, fixed in place by a steady hand that had long since disappeared. "Elias," a voice whispered. It came from a man standing under a street lamp. He was dressed like a detective from a 1940s thriller, but his face was a blur of smudged graphite. He held a cigarette that produced no smoke, only a thin, black line that drifted upward and merged with the sky. "I'm the editor," the man said. He didn't move his mouth. The words just appeared in the air between us, written in a sharp, cursive script before dissolving into the wind. "And you're a scene that's running too long. We need to cut you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a pair of scissors. They were huge, made of cold, gleaming silver that felt more real than anything else in this world. I ran through the ink-stained streets, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The city changed with every block. One moment I was in a labyrinth of filing cabinets. The next I was in a forest of dead trees that looked like they had been drawn with a broken nib. I realized that this wasn't just a world. It was a graveyard of stories. Every discarded idea, every failed script, every forgotten character was dumped here, in the archive of impossible objects. And I was just the latest addition. I found a bar called The Last Frame. It was the only building that looked stable. I pushed through the swinging doors and found a room full of people, but they weren't moving. They were frozen in mid-action, like a paused film. A bartender was pouring a drink that was frozen in a crystal arc of black liquid. A couple was locked in an eternal embrace, their faces forever hidden in shadow. In the center of the room sat a woman. She was the only one who moved. Her hair was a waterfall of ink, and her eyes were two bright white circles. "You're the hunter," she said. Her voice was like the sound of a violin string snapping. "I'm just a man who watched the wrong film," I replied. She gestured to the wall behind her, covered in thousands of tiny screens, each playing a different nightmare. "There are no wrong films here, only hungry ones. The archive doesn't just store stories, Elias. It eats them. It needs the soul of the observer to keep the ink flowing. Without us, this world would dry up and turn to dust." She leaned in closer, and I saw that her skin was covered in fine, microscopic text, the history of everyone who had ever been trapped here. "The man you saw in the film, the one who looked like you, he was the one before you. He traded his place for yours, and now you must find someone to take yours." I refused. I wouldn't do that. But the ink in my veins was beginning to feel cold and sluggish. "Then you will fade," she whispered. "Look at your hands." My fingers were starting to lose their outlines. The charcoal was blurring, the edges of my body merging with the shadows of the bar. I was becoming background detail. "There is another way," she said, her white eyes glowing. "The projector. It's in the tower at the center of the city. If you can reach it, you can change the ending. You can draw yourself out." I didn't wait. I burst out of the bar and headed toward the tower. It was a monolithic structure that pierced the gray sky, looking like the giant arm of a record player. The city tried to stop me. The inkmen emerged from the alleys, their bodies shifting and stretching like shadows at sunset. I climbed the tower, my hands slipping on the metallic surface. The wind howled, sounding like the screams of 1,000 celluloid ghosts. At the top, I found the room. It was an exact replica of my basement. The desk, the scotch, the projector. But sitting in the chair was a version of me made entirely of light. No lines, no shadows. Just pure, blinding white. "You're late," the light Elias said. "I'm here to finish the story," I said, grabbing a stylus that lay on the desk. It was heavy, tipped with a diamond that shone with a fierce intensity. We fought in the flickering light. It was a fight of reality itself. Every time he touched me, I felt a part of my memory vanish. Every time I struck him, I carved a new line into his perfect light. The projector between us began to spin wildly. The film was flapping, the end of the reel whipping around like a lash. I grabbed the end of the film and jammed it into the light source. The tower shook. The city outside began to scream. The Inkmen dissolved into puddles of black liquid. The sky cracked open, revealing the wooden rafters of a giant cosmic attic. The light Elias disintegrated into a cloud of white sparks. I was alone in the room. I sat down in the chair. My hands were no longer gray. I felt the warmth of my own blood. I reached for the glass of scotch. It was cold. It was real. I looked at the wall. The screen was blank. I had won. Or so I thought. But the transition wasn't a cut. It was a fade. My reality began to dissolve into a series of static frames. I felt my heartbeat slow down, matching the frames per second of the projector. The world was no longer a fluid motion, but a sequence of stuttering moments. I saw the air between my fingers. It wasn't empty space anymore. It was filled with dust, hair, and scratches, the literal debris of a film strip. I realized then that the editor I met wasn't a villain. He was a mercy. He was trying to cut me out before I became part of the permanent record. But I had fought him. I had insisted on my own continuity, and now I was paying the price. I wandered into the dead reel section of the city. Here, the buildings weren't just drawn, they were unfinished. Scaffolding made of pencil lines reached into a white void. People walked by with no faces, just oval smudges where their features should be. They were the background characters, the extras who were never given a name or a purpose. They lived in a state of perpetual waiting, hoping for a director who would never come. "Help me," one of them whispered. It had no mouth, but the words appeared as subtitles at the bottom of my vision. I tried to touch its shoulder, but my hand was now so dark with ink that I left a permanent black smear on its gray coat. The creature recoiled, and the smear began to spread like a cancer. In this world, I was a high-contrast entity. I was too real, too detailed for this low-resolution purgatory. My presence was destroying the very world I was trying to navigate. I saw the chemical sea at the edge of the city, a vast, churning ocean of developer fluid and fixer. It was where the stories went to be erased. The waves were a deep, toxic silver, and they crashed against the shore with the sound of breaking glass. I stood at the edge, looking out into the infinite white horizon. I knew that if I stepped into that sea, I would be wiped clean. Elias would cease to exist. No more basement, no more archive, no more ghost hunting. Just a clean, unexposed strip of film. But the archive wouldn't let me go. The ground beneath me began to tilt. The entire world was being fed into a giant, invisible machine. I looked up and saw the teeth of the sprockets, huge, jagged gears of light that were pulling the sky itself downward. The archive was being rewound. The gravity shifted, and I was thrown back toward the tower. But the tower was changing. It was no longer a building, it was a giant lens, miles wide, focusing the light of a dying sun onto a single point, and that point was me. I felt the heat. It wasn't the heat of fire, but the heat of a projector lamp left on a single frame for too long. My skin began to bubble. The charcoal lines of my face began to melt and run like tears. I was burning the frame. "Stop it," I screamed, but the only sound was the roar of the cooling fans from the world above. I saw the bubble forming in the center of my vision, a brown, searing hole that expanded outward, eating the world. The buildings, the Inkmen, the faceless extras. They were all being consumed by the heat. The film was melting. And through that melting hole, I saw you. Not the light Elias from before. Not a character. I saw the room you are sitting in right now. I saw the glow of your monitor reflecting in your eyes. I saw the slight movement of your hand as you adjusted your headset. For a brief, agonizing second, the barrier was gone. I wasn't a story, and you were an observer. We were 2 points of consciousness staring at each other through a burning hole in the universe. I reached out my melting hand, trying to grab the edge of your screen. I wanted to pull myself into your world, to breathe your oxygen, to feel the weight of a world that wasn't made of ink. But the film snapped. The darkness was sudden and absolute. I felt myself tumbling through a void where time had no meaning. I wasn't Elias anymore. I was just a sequence of data, a flicker of electricity in a vast network. I saw the history of the world laid out like a storyboard, from the first charcoal drawings on a cave wall to the digital simulations of the future. It was all the same. Desperate attempt to capture a moment, to freeze time, to keep the darkness at bay. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the chair. The basement was exactly as it had been. The smell of tobacco, the shattered glass of scotch, the rhythmic click-clack of the projector. But something was different. The silence was louder. The shadows were heavier. I checked my watch. It had stopped. The hands were frozen at the exact moment the film had snapped. I looked at the wall. The screen was white. But as I watched, a single drop of black ink began to bloom in the center of the light. It didn't spread like a normal liquid. It grew in jagged, intentional strokes, forming a shape, a face. It was the face of the viewer I had seen through the burning hole. Your face. Is it my turn now? The image on the wall asked. The voice came from the projector, but it sounded like a recording of your own thoughts. I realized the ultimate horror of the archive. It doesn't matter if you escape the film. You can never escape the audience. The archive isn't a collection of movies. It's a cycle of consumption. To be watched is to be possessed. To watch is to be infected. The viewer on the wall reached out, and for a second I thought I felt a hand on my shoulder. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just sat there, watching the ink bloom and fade, waiting for the next reel to begin. I knew that somewhere, in another basement, in another city, someone else was finding a rusted tin canister. Someone else was threading the film. Someone else was about to become the next subject in the archive of impossible objects. And I would be there, waiting for them in the shadows. I would be the ink man. I would be the smudge in a corner of their eye. I would be the voice that whispers, "Don't look back." Because the story never ends. It just changes perspective. The camera is always rolling. The light is always burning, and the ink never ever dries. I pick up the rusted tin. I place the reel back inside. I label it subject 4-2. I put it back at the bottom of the crate. I sit back in my chair and pour another glass of scotch. My hands are steady now. I am no longer afraid. Why should I be? I am part of the masterpiece. Welcome to the archive, subject 403. The loop has reset, but this time you're the one in the coat. This time you're the one with the scotch. This time you're the one who found the canister. Don't bother bolting the door. It won't help. The ink is already inside. It's in your eyes. It's in your blood. It's in every word you speak. Enjoy the show. It's going to be a long one. And remember, whatever you do, whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't stop watching. The rhythmic click-clack starts again. The light hits the wall. They say the camera never lies. The voice is yours now.